When Alessandro Moretti, the most formidable capo in all of New York, stepped inside Le Noir, the life in the room simply stopped. Every eye was drawn to the man who held the city's very skyline in the palm of his hand. But the woman on his arm made a catastrophic error in judgment. She chose to laugh at the waitress. With a dismissive point at the wine list, she sneered with venom. "She cannot even read the menu, Alessandro. It is just pathetic." What she failed to realize was that this particular waitress carried a secret potent enough to incinerate their entire empire. So when Sophie finally opened her mouth, she did more than just read the menu. She brought the devil himself to a complete and utter standstill. This is the unbelievable true account of how a single glass of red wine would forever alter the balance of the criminal underworld. This is a story about a woman who had nothing left, except the one thing no one could take from her, her mind. If you have ever been treated as invisible, laughed at, or counted out, stay until the very last word. You will not regret it. The downpour over Manhattan never washed anything clean. It only added a treacherous sheen to the city's inherent filth. But inside the opulent walls of Le Noir, the outside world was a distant, irrelevant thought. The atmosphere inside was thick with the scent of inherited wealth, expensive truffle oil, and a pervasive, unspoken fear. At table 4, Sophie was carefully aligning the silverware, though her fingers betrayed her with a slight, persistent tremor. It wasn't from the chill, it was from the gnawing ache of hunger in her stomach. A proper meal had been a luxury she could not afford for the past 2 days, forcing her to subsist on the hardened baguettes that the sous chef, Jean-Luc, would toss out the kitchen's back door just after midnight. To the wealthy patrons of Le Noir, Sophie was nothing more than a functional piece of the decor. She was an indistinct shape of black fabric and a crisp white apron, a silent specter holding a notepad. "You should check your reflection, Sophie," Monsieur Laurent, the maitre d', hissed in a low voice as he floated by her station. "Table 4 has been reserved. It is for the Moretti party." The name alone was powerful enough to plunge the room's temperature down by 10 degrees. Sophie's entire body went rigid. There was not a soul in New York who was unfamiliar with the Morettis. Their influence had long outgrown the unions and the shipping docks. Now, they owned the very sky. Alessandro Moretti, the youngest don of the family and by far the most ruthless, was a man whose quietest whisper carried more weight than a gunshot. He had built a reputation on 2 things: his unnerving deep silence and his absolute demand for perfection in all things. "I am ready, monsieur," Sophie replied in a near whisper, carefully tucking a loose strand of honey-blonde hair behind her ear. She purposefully kept her gaze fixed on the floor. It was the unwritten rule of survival in this world. Keep your head down, and you might just stay alive. Precisely at 8 o'clock in the evening, the immense oak doors of the restaurant swung open. The dining room, which usually buzzed with the low hum of polite chatter and the gentle clinking of crystal, was plunged into an abrupt, deathly silence. It felt as if all the oxygen had been violently vacuumed from the space. Alessandro Moretti was the first to enter. He was significantly taller than he appeared in the grainy paparazzi photographs, dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit that surely cost more than every dollar Sophie had ever earned in her entire life. His face was a carefully constructed mask of disinterested apathy. His jawline was so sharp it looked like it could slice through glass, and his eyes were dark, profoundly intelligent, and utterly devoid of any human warmth. Trailing closely behind him were 2 bodyguards, immense men who appeared to have been chiseled directly from granite, and a woman. This woman was breathtaking in the way a flawless diamond is breathtaking. She was cold, hard, and clearly designed for admiration from a distance. A crimson dress clung to her figure like it was a second skin. Her name was Camilla Vans. No, that was not right. It was Camilla Russo now, a well-known socialite who was transparently desperate to secure a wedding ring on her finger before the end of the fiscal quarter. "This way, signore," Laurent murmured, bowing so profoundly that his nose nearly grazed the plush carpet. They were led to table 4, which was located directly in Sophie's assigned station. She dutifully waited the prescribed 30 seconds before she dared to approach them. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribcage, like a bird trapped in a cage. She absolutely had to keep this job. She desperately needed the tips from this shift. Her rent was already 3 weeks overdue, and her landlord, a perpetually sweaty man by the name of Mr. Henderson, had made a clear threat to change the locks on her apartment by Friday. "Good evening," Sophie said, her voice managing to be soft, yet remarkably steady. "Water for the table?" Alessandro did not even bother to look up from the vintage Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. He simply waved a hand in a gesture of casual dismissal. Camilla, on the other hand, looked directly up at her. Her gaze swept over Sophie, starting from her worn-out shoes and traveling all the way up to her slightly frayed collar, her lips curling into a mask of instant disdain. In Camilla's world, Sophie was not another human being. She was merely a temporary obstruction, something standing in the way of Alessandro's undivided attention. "Sparkling," Camilla snapped without ceremony. "And I want the wine list. Bring the reserve list, not the cheap house garbage you probably serve to everyone else." "Certainly, madame." Sophie moved with practiced grace to retrieve the heavy, leather-bound book. Upon her return, she placed it with reverence in front of Alessandro. He paid it no mind. "Read it for me, darling," he instructed Camilla, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate deep inside Sophie's chest. "I have a headache," Camilla complained with a theatrical whine. She flipped open the massive book, her perfectly manicured fingernails tapping impatiently against the expensive parchment. However, as her eyes attempted to scan the pages, her confident smile began to waver and then fade completely. The menu at Lito Noir was not just written in French, it was composed in an archaic, deliberately pretentious dialect, handwritten in an elaborate cursive script. It detailed vintages and obscure regions that would require a certified sommelier to properly understand. Camilla narrowed her eyes in concentration. She turned one page, and then another, her confusion growing more apparent. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. "Well," Camilla giggled, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder, "it is all just French, is it not? Alessandro, darling, why do we not just order the Cabernet?" "Because I do not want a Cabernet," Alessandro stated flatly, his attention finally lifting from his watch. His dark eyes drilled into Camilla, who visibly flinched. "I want the 82 Bordeaux. You will find it for me." A wave of panic washed over Camilla's face as she frantically scanned the page before her. She quickly pointed to a random line on the list. "Here, this one must be it." At that moment, Sophie leaned forward to pour their water. Her eyes unintentionally flickered toward the line Camilla was indicating. It was not a Bordeaux at all. It was an incredibly cheap table wine from the Loire Valley, its price massively inflated for unsuspecting tourists. "Actually," Camilla snapped, her voice sharp as she caught Sophie's brief glance. She felt utterly foolish, and she desperately needed someone to blame. "Why do we not just ask her? Just look at her." Camilla let out a laugh, a cruel, tinkling sound that seemed to echo across the now completely silent restaurant. "She is just staring at the page as if she is trying to solve a complicated math problem. She probably cannot even read the menu, Alessandro. It is just pathetic. These kinds of places will hire anyone right off the street these days." A profound hush fell over the restaurant. Other diners were frozen in place, their forks hovering in midair on the way to their mouths. Alessandro shifted his weight in his seat. He then turned his head and looked at Sophie for the very first time. He truly looked at her. He noticed the worn cuffs of her uniform, the deep exhaustion in her eyes, and the scuffed toes of her cheap shoes. "Is that true?" Alessandro asked, his voice becoming dangerously soft. "Can you not read the menu?" Was an impossible question, a carefully laid trap. If she answered yes, she would be admitting her own incompetence. If she answered no, she would be directly contradicting a guest, which was a cardinal sin in the service industry. Camilla smirked, sensing her victory. "Of course she cannot. Go on, get someone who actually knows what they are doing," Shoo! Sophie stood frozen, the insult burning like a white-hot coal in her stomach. It was not the casual cruelty that wounded her so deeply. It was the baseless assumption that she was stupid. They looked at her and saw only a waitress. They saw a complete nobody. They did not see Sophie Dubois, a former prodigy of the Sorbonne. They did not see the daughter of a disgraced diplomat who had spent the summers of her childhood wandering through the sprawling vineyards of Provence, long before her father's catastrophic gambling debts had forced their family into hiding in America. Sophie's hand tightened its grip on the water pitcher. The smart thing to do was to walk away. She should go and get Monsieur Laurent. But then, her eyes met Alessandro's. He was not sneering at her like Camilla. Instead, he was observing her with a strange, predatory intensity. He was waiting, she realized, to see if she would break under the pressure. Sophie took a slow, deliberate breath. She placed the pitcher down on the table. The sound it made was a soft, definitive thud against the linen tablecloth. She turned to face Camilla, her posture undergoing a stunning transformation. The submissive, apologetic slouch of a servant was completely gone. "Vous vous trompez, mademoiselle," Sophie said. Her voice had changed entirely. The hesitant American accent had vanished, and in its place was the crisp, melodic, and undeniably authoritative cadence of a native Parisian speaker. Camilla just blinked, completely bewildered. "What?" Sophie continued, her gaze shifting and locking onto Alessandro's. She spoke in fluent French, and the words flowed from her so perfectly that it sounded like a piece of music. "That is a dry white wine, quite acidic, and it is typically paired with oysters. It is most certainly not a Bordeaux. If Monsieur desires the 1982 vintage, he is actually looking for the Chateau Mouton Rothschild, which is located on page 14, the third line up from the bottom." She reached across the table, her hand perfectly steady, and flipped through the heavy pages of the wine list with a single graceful motion. She landed precisely on page 14. "Furthermore," Sophie added, switching back to a flawless, unaccented English, her voice now cool and utterly professional, "the vintage you were pointing at, mademoiselle, is known to be corked. Monsieur Laurent keeps it on the list as a method for testing tourists. I would never dream of serving it to a palate as refined and distinguished as Mr. Moretti's." There was only silence. It was an absolute, suffocating silence that filled every corner of the room. Monsieur Laurent, who had been rushing over to intervene, skidded to an abrupt halt, his mouth hanging wide open in disbelief. Camilla's face turned a violent, blotchy shade of crimson. She sputtered incoherently. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Alessandro simply raised his hand, lifting a single finger. Camilla's mouth snapped shut as if on a hinge. Alessandro slowly shifted his gaze from the wine list and settled it back on Sophie. The look of utter boredom was now completely gone from his eyes. It had been replaced by something far more dangerous. It was interest. "You speak French," Alessandro stated. It was not a question. It was a declaration. "I do," Sophie replied, holding his intense gaze without flinching. She was almost certain she was about to be fired. At this point, she did not care. "And you know about wine. I know that serving a muscadet with a fine steak would be a crime against humanity, signore." For the first time, a corner of Alessandro's mouth twitched, forming something that was almost a smile. "What is your name?" "Sophie." "Sophie," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue, rolling it around as if it were a fine sip of whiskey. "You are not from Brooklyn, are you, Sophie?" "Everyone is from somewhere, Mr. Moretti. For tonight, I am simply from table 4. Alessandro stared at her for a long, heavy moment that felt like an eternity. Then he closed the wine list with a soft thud. "Get the Rothschild," he commanded, his eyes never breaking contact with hers. "And you will bring another glass." Camilla's face immediately brightened. "Oh, Alessandro, you are too kind to me." "It is not for you," Alessandro said coldly, cutting her off without a second thought. He gestured toward the empty seat across from him, the chair right next to Camilla. It is for her. He pointed a single, definitive finger at Sophie. Sit down, Sophie. A collective gasp swept through the entire restaurant. A waitress being invited to sit with the Don himself. It was completely unheard of. It was practically a death sentence. Sir, I cannot, Sophie stammered, the surge of adrenaline quickly fading and giving way to a new wave of fear. My shift is not over. Monsieur Laurent will fire me. Alessandro turned his head just slightly to look at the terrifyingly pale manager, who was standing frozen about 5 feet away. Laurent, Alessandro said with unnerving calm. Sophie is finished with her work for the evening. From now on, she is my guest. Place her meal on my account, and if she is dismissed from her position, this restaurant, Le Val Noir, will be a pile of smoldering ash before the sun rises. Do you comprehend? Laurent's head bobbed with such frantic energy, his eyeglasses almost flew from his face. Yes, Mr. Moretti. Absolutely, of course. Sophie, please, have a seat. Sophie's gaze flickered from the empty chair to the enraged, utterly disgraced face of Camilla, and then finally to the deep, bottomless eyes of Alessandro Moretti. She lowered herself into the seat, and in that single motion, one life came to an end, and another, far more dangerous one, truly started. The chair was upholstered in a soft, expensive velvet, a world away from the hard, unforgiving wooden stool where Sophie normally sat in the break room, forcing down her piece of dry bread. But she was too numb to register the luxury. The only thing she could perceive was the crushing intensity of Alejandro Moretti's gaze. It felt tangible, almost physical, like a firm hand wrapping itself around her throat and squeezing. On the other side of the table, Camilla Russo looked as if she had just been forced to swallow a whole lemon. Her meticulously applied foundation was cracking around a mask of pure, unbridled fury. Alejandro, Camilla spat, her voice a shaking whisper. This has to be some kind of joke. Is this a test? You cannot possibly be letting the staff join us at our table. Alejandro's eyes never left Sophie. He simply gestured to the wine. Pour it, Sophie. Sophie's hands trembled violently as she reached for the bottle of Chateau Mouton Rothschild. She recognized the vintage, a 1982, which was worth well over 3 months of her meager rent. She carefully decanted the bottle with a fluid grace, letting the muscle memory from a former life guide her hands. She poured a small amount for Alejandro to sample. He lifted the glass, swirling the deep crimson wine, and breathed in its complex aroma before taking a small taste. He gave a slight nod of approval. Sophie proceeded to fill his glass, and then, defiantly, she filled her own. She completely ignored Camilla's empty glass. You are ignoring me, Camilla shrieked, her hand crashing down on the table with a loud bang. The silverware jumped and rattled. I am the daughter of Senator Russo. You have no idea what my father will— Your father, Alejandro cut in, his voice a low and deeply bored rumble, currently owes me 3 very large favors and a debt of $4 million. If I were to inform him that I abandoned you on a street corner simply because you were irritating me, his first instinct would be to call me and apologize for the inconvenience you caused. Camilla's jaw dropped, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Sophie, Alejandro said, his full attention returning to the woman beside him. Tell me your thoughts on the wine. Sophie lifted her glass and took a delicate sip. The flavor that flooded her senses felt like a distant, painful memory. It tasted of black currant, of cedar wood, of an expensive cigar box. It was the taste of her father's private study. Long before the police sirens came, it tasted of a safety she had long since lost. It is bold, Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. The structure is truly impeccable. The tannins have mellowed beautifully over the years, but they still possess a firm grip. It has an exceptionally long finish. It is a survivor. A survivor? Alejandro echoed, his eyes studying her face intently. Much like you? Sophie slowly lowered her glass to the table. I am afraid I do not understand what you mean, sir. Oh, please, Camilla sneered, pushing her chair back and rising to her feet. She clutched her small purse so tightly, her knuckles turned white. I have no intention of staying for this ridiculous performance. If you wish to dine with this little rat, then feel free, but I hope you catch fleas. She spun around to make a dramatic exit, but paused to snatch her glass of water from the table. With a final look of pure spite, she hurled the entire contents directly at Sophie. Everything seemed to unfold in slow motion. Sophie instinctively flinched away, shutting her eyes tightly and bracing for the cold, humiliating splash. But the icy shock never arrived. She hesitantly opened her eyes. Alejandro had moved with a predatory quickness that seemed to bend the laws of physics. His large hand was raised, forming a shield that blocked the entire spray of water. The clear liquid dripped harmlessly from the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket, pooling on the white tablecloth. Not a single drop of his wine had been disturbed. A profound silence fell over the entire restaurant. It was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the clatter from the kitchen had ceased. Alejandro rose from his seat with a slow, deliberate grace. He carefully removed his soaked jacket and passed it to one of his stone-faced bodyguards without a word. Only then did he turn his gaze to Camilla. "Leave," he breathed. It was not a command shouted in anger. It was a sound as final and chilling as a coffin lid being sealed shut. Camilla's face went ghost white as the full weight of her mistake crashed down upon her. She had just physically assaulted a capo. She pivoted and fled, her expensive heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the hardwood floor until she disappeared through the front doors and out into the rainy street. Alejandro calmly sat back down. He was now just in his dress shirt, the crisp white cotton pulled taut across his powerful shoulders. A dark leather gun holster was now plainly visible beneath his left arm. He made no effort to conceal it. "My apologies," he said, his voice returning to a normal volume as he addressed Sophie. "The garbage has now been disposed of." Sophie could only stare at him, her mind reeling. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because you can distinguish between a Muscadet and a Bordeaux," he answered, smoothly cutting a piece of his steak. "And because your eyes hold the look of a woman who is desperately running from her past, and I have a deep dislike for wasted potential." He ate the piece of steak, chewing with deliberate slowness, before gesturing at her plate with his fork. "You should eat. You look as if you have not had a proper source of protein in at least a week." Sophie cautiously picked up her own fork. The truth was, she was ravenous. The rich, savory aroma of the ribeye steak was almost overwhelming. She took a small bite, fighting to suppress a sound of pure satisfaction. "So," Alejandro began, swirling the wine in his glass, "we have Sophie, with no last name. You possess a perfect command of French, an intimate knowledge of rare vintages, and yet you are working a miserable job where your own manager fills you with terror. Allow me to venture a guess." He leaned forward across the table, his dark, penetrating eyes narrowing on her. "A disgraced socialite, perhaps?" "No, you carry yourself with too much resilience for that." "A runaway wife, then?" "Also no. There is no pale mark on your ring finger. That can only leave trouble with your family." Sophie went rigid, her body freezing in place. She carefully set her fork back on the plate. "I am just a waitress, Mr. Moretti. You are a liar." A faint smile touched his lips. It was the predatory smile of a wolf, revealing perfectly straight, white teeth. "You are Arthur Dubois's daughter." The name shattered her composure. The glass simply fell from Sophie's suddenly nerveless fingers. It did not just crack when it hit the table, it exploded into pieces. The rich red wine, the priceless 1982 Rothschild, bled out across the white linen like a fresh gunshot wound. "How?" Sophie whispered, the blood draining from her face, a chill spreading through her veins. "How could you possibly know that name?" "Your father was a bona fide legend in the more discreet smuggling communities," Alejandro explained, completely unfazed by the spreading red stain. He casually signaled for Lauron to bring another napkin. "Your father moved priceless art, rare gems, sensitive information. They had a nickname for him, the the diplomat. Then, about 3 years ago, he disappeared completely, taking with him something incredibly valuable, something that did not belong to him. Alejandro's relaxed expression hardened into something dangerous. He took something that belonged to the Moretti family. Sophie shoved her chair backward, a raw, desperate panic beginning to claw its way up her throat. I swear I do not know where he is. I have not had any contact with him in 3 years. Please just let me go. I just want to go home. You cannot go home, Sophie, Alejandro stated, his voice now gentle but firm. And why not? Because if I was able to find you, he said, giving a subtle nod toward the street where several dark sport utility vehicles were now parked and idling in the downpour. It means that Stefano Greco has found you as well. And you must understand, unlike me, Greco does not have an appreciation for fine wine. He has a preference for blood. As if summoned by his very name, the massive plate-glass front window of Le Val Noir did not just break, it detonated inward. The sound was a deafening explosion of crystal. Countless shards of glass rained down upon the dining room, glittering like deadly diamond dust. Screams tore through the air. Wealthy patrons scrambled for safety, diving beneath their tables. Sophie never even had the chance to scream. Before her mind could fully register that they were in the middle of a drive-by shooting, a solid, heavy weight crashed into her, sending her and her chair toppling backward onto the floor. Alejandro was covering her, his entire body a shield over hers. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back, and her senses were flooded with the sharp smell of gunpowder and his expensive cologne. Pop, 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 pop. A spray of bullets ripped through the velvet upholstery of the booth where they had been sitting only moments before. Bottles of rare liquor behind the bar exploded one by one, showering the terrified, cowering bartender in alcohol and shattered glass. Stay down! Alejandro's voice was a powerful roar, a commanding presence that cut through the terror and chaos. He moved with fluid efficiency, pulling a sleek, matte black pistol from the holster under his arm. He fired 3 precise shots toward the shattered window, each one calm and calculated, meant to suppress their unseen attackers outside. Dante, secure the back, Alejandro yelled. One of the bodyguards, the man called Dante, was already in motion, kicking a heavy dining table on its side for cover and beginning to return fire. Sophie was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering together from shock and fear. What is going on? Who are those people? Greco! Alejandro spat the name like a curse. He looked down at her, his face now just inches from hers. A thin line of blood trickled from his cheek, the result of a small cut from a piece of flying glass. He is after you. He believes you are in possession of the key. The key to what? I do not have anything, Sophie cried out, hot tears now streaking through the dust and grime on her face. We are moving right now. Alejandro seized her arm, his grip feeling like it was forged from solid iron. He pulled her to her feet, forcing her to stay low, bent nearly double as they made a desperate run toward the kitchen. They slammed through the swinging doors, shocking the chefs into frozen silence. Get out the back! Go now! Alejandro commanded the staff. They did not need to be told a second time. The entire kitchen crew scrambled into the alley. Alejandro then dragged Sophie through the chaotic kitchen, past clouds of steam and the smell of grease, and pushed open the heavy steel door that led into the rain-soaked alleyway. A massive black armored sport utility vehicle screeched to a halt directly in front of them. The side door slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Get inside. Alejandro practically threw her into the vehicle before leaping in right behind her. The tires screamed and smoked against the wet asphalt as the driver accelerated violently, peeling away just as a powerful motorcycle rounded the corner into the alley. The rider was already raising a submachine gun. A spray of bullets pinged harmlessly against the reinforced glass of the sport utility vehicle. Sophie huddled herself into a tight ball in the corner of the plush leather seat, wrapping her arms around her knees. She was drenched, shivering from both the cold and the profound shock. Alejandro sat calmly on the seat opposite her. He holstered his pistol and then casually straightened the cuffs of his shirt. He appeared unnervingly composed, as if he had just concluded a slightly tedious business meeting rather than survived a deadly shootout. "Have you been hit?" he asked her directly. Sophie quickly patted herself down, her hands still shaking. "No, no, I do not think I was." She then looked up at him. "But you are bleeding." Alejandro lightly touched his cheek, then examined the smear of blood on his fingertips with disinterest. "It is nothing of consequence." He opened a hidden compartment in the armrest and retrieved a bottle of water and a clean towel. He tossed both items to her. "Clean yourself up. You look like you have seen a ghost." Sophie gratefully wiped the grime and tears from her face. You said that they want the key. What key are you talking about?" "My father left our family with nothing but a mountain of debt. We lost our vineyard, our flat in Paris. We lost absolutely everything. I have been working as a waitress for 2 solid years just to afford the rent on a tiny apartment." Alejandro observed her closely, his eyes analyzing every subtle shift in her expression. He was like a human lie detector, one who had been trained by the most ruthless masters in the criminal underworld. He could see genuine fear, utter confusion, and deep-seated exhaustion in her eyes. What he did not see was a single trace of deception. Arthur did not just steal money, Sophie. He stole a ledger. It was an encrypted digital drive that contained the secret routing numbers for the entire East Coast Syndicate's network of offshore accounts. Greco wants that ledger so he can seize control of the city, and I wanted it to make sure he never could. "I swear I do not have it," Sophie insisted, her voice tight with desperation. "Perhaps not consciously," Alejandro replied, his tone dangerously smooth. "But Arthur was always a sentimental man, a complete fool for the people he loved. He would have concealed it somewhere near you, a place he considered truly safe." The luxury car began to decelerate, its motion unnervingly silent. Sophie pressed her face to the window, watching the familiar lights of Manhattan bleed away. They were crossing a bridge, moving into the stark industrial silhouette of the docklands. But instead of continuing into the darkness, the car turned sharply toward a massive high-rise that pierced the sky above the river. "Where are you taking me?" "My residence," Alejandro stated simply. "Absolutely not." Sophie felt a surge of real panic. "Take me back to my apartment right now. I have to get my things. My mother's locket is in my room." Alejandro let out a long, weary sigh. He tapped lightly on the glass partition. "Driver, we are making a detour to Queens, 42nd Street." "Sir, that area is not secure," the driver protested, his voice a low rumble that matched his thick, powerful neck. "Just do it," Alessandro commanded, his word final. The journey to Queens was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. As they approached Sophie's building, a decaying brick tenement with paint curling off the walls like sunburnt skin, Alessandro gestured for his men to stay put. "I will be accompanying you upstairs," he announced. "I am perfectly capable of packing my own bag," Sophie retorted, fighting to hold on to the last fragile piece of her independence. "Sophie," Alessandro's voice dropped, becoming a low and serious octave. "I need you to look at your front door." Sophie followed his gaze up to the second floor window of her apartment. A single light was burning inside. She never, ever left that light on. A cold dread seized her, and she burst from the car. "Sophie, wait for me!" Alessandro swore under his breath and sprinted after her. Sophie flew up the worn stairs, taking them 2 at a time. She finally reached her landing, her door. The lock had been utterly destroyed. The wood of the frame was splintered and shattered. With a trembling hand, she pushed it open. The scream she felt building inside her died before it could even form. The apartment had not just been searched, it had been completely disemboweled. Her mattress was violently slashed open, its stuffing spilling onto the floor like grotesque entrails. The inexpensive dresser was in pieces. Every piece of her clothing was torn and thrown about the room. The floorboards themselves had been pried up and broken. Even the wallpaper was ripped from the walls. "No," she whimpered, the sound barely audible. She collapsed to her knees, crawling blindly through the wreckage of her life. "No, please, no." Her hands scrambled under the broken frame of her bed, searching for the loose floorboard she had always used as her secret hiding place. Her fingers found only empty space. "The locket," she began to sob, the sound raw and broken. "They took the locket. It had the only photograph I have of my mother inside." Alessandro appeared in the doorway behind her. He scanned the utter devastation with a detached, methodical gaze. This was clearly Greco's handiwork. It was messy, excessively brutal, and designed to send a message. He moved across the ruined room to where Sophie knelt. He offered no empty reassurances. He did not tell her that everything would be okay. Instead, he crouched down beside her, the fine fabric of his expensive suit, trousers settling into the filth on the floor. He reached out a hand and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his intense eyes. "They did not manage to find what they were truly looking for," Alessandro said, his voice calm and certain. "They took everything," Sophie cried out, her voice choked with grief. "They took junk and worthless keepsakes. If they had located the drive, Sophie, they would have burned this entire building to the ground just to eliminate any trace. They are still out there hunting for it." He rose to his feet and offered his hand down to her. "There is nothing left for you here, Sophie. You have no job, you have no home, and your past has been erased." Sophie stared at his outstretched hand. It was large and calloused, a steady and powerful hand that belonged to a killer. But in that moment, it was the only solid thing in a world that had completely fallen apart. "Come with me," Alessandro said, his voice a low command. "I promise I will recover your locket. I will ensure your father's debt is finally settled. But from this moment forward, you have to belong to me." "Belong to you?" Sophie whispered, the words catching in her throat. "As if I were a piece of property?" "More like a partner," Alessandro corrected her smoothly. "I have a need for your mind. You have a need for my protection until Greco is eliminated. You are Sophie Moretti." Sophie wavered for a long moment. Then, as the distant cry of sirens began to grow louder, she placed her small hand into his. He pulled her up from the floor, drawing her close against him, and for one impossibly brief second, she actually felt safe. "Let us go home," he murmured. His penthouse was nothing like a home. It was a sterile fortress suspended in the sky. The private elevator doors slid open to reveal a living room that was bigger than her entire apartment building. Immense floor-to-ceiling glass walls provided a breathtaking, glittering panorama of the Manhattan skyline. The furniture was sleek, modern, and Italian. Every surface was either black, white, or polished chrome. It was an incredibly beautiful space, but it was also cold and overwhelmingly masculine. "Dante!" Alessandro barked the moment they stepped inside. "Secure the entire perimeter. I want double the number of guards posted in the lobby. Nobody comes upstairs unless I personally authorize their entry. And inform the chef to prepare a light meal and to send for a doctor." "I do not require a doctor," Sophie said, wrapping her arms around herself. She was still in her waitress uniform, which was now smeared with red wine and covered in dust. She felt profoundly and ridiculously out of place in this palace of glass and steel. "You have several cuts on your arms from the broken glass," Alessandro noted, methodically loosening his tie. He crossed the room to a fully stocked wet bar and poured a generous amount of amber liquid into 2 glasses. He returned and handed one to her. "It is brandy. You should drink it." Sophie took a small sip. The liquid burned a path down her throat, but it began to calm the frantic beating of her heart. "There is a guest room just down the hall," Alessandro gestured vaguely. "You will find clothes in the closet there. They were my sister's old things. She often leaves them here when she visits. They should be your size. Take a shower, get changed, and then meet me in my study." "And what if I decide to refuse?" Sophie asked, a small ember of her usual defiance finally reigniting. Alessandro stopped what he was doing. He turned and gave her a long look, his gaze so intense it made her knees feel weak. The door is not locked, Sophie. You are free to leave whenever you wish. But you must understand that out there, you are nothing but prey. In here, you are my guest. The choice is yours. He turned without another word and walked toward a set of large, heavy double doors, leaving her completely alone in the enormous, silent room. Sophie stared at the elevator doors. She could make a run for it. She could try to find the police, but the police were almost certainly on Greco's payroll, or possibly even Alessandro's. Her father had taught her that much about the world. There is no such thing as law, Arthur used to tell her. There is only power. She turned her back on the elevator and walked toward the guest room. The shower felt like a cleansing waterfall, its hot water washing away the grime of the restaurant and the dust of her annihilated apartment. She scrubbed at her skin until it was flushed and pink. When she stepped out, she found the clothes Alessandro had mentioned. There were silk blouses and cashmere sweaters. She selected a simple, oversized white shirt and a pair of black leggings. She faced the mirror. The young woman who stared back at her looked different, somehow harder and more resolute. She made her way to the study. The heavy doors were ajar. Inside, the room was lined from floor to ceiling with books. Alessandro was seated behind a gigantic mahogany desk, surrounded by multiple monitors and towering stacks of documents. He had changed into a form-fitting black t-shirt, which revealed powerful muscular arms covered in intricate tattoos. The black ink looked like vines and thorns wrapping tightly around his biceps. Much better, he said, his eyes remaining fixed on the document he was reading. You said that you needed my brain, Sophie stated, stopping directly in front of his imposing desk. I have to assume you do not need me to start reciting wine vintages for you. Without looking up, Alessandro slid a single piece of paper across the polished surface of the desk. It was old and yellowed with age, covered in a handwritten cipher. This is a letter that your father sent to me 3 days before he disappeared, Alessandro explained. We managed to intercept it, but we were never able to decipher it. My team of cryptographers told me it was complete gibberish, just some random lines of French poetry. Sophie reached out and took the paper, her breath catching in her throat. She instantly recognized the familiar script, the elegant looping L's and the sharp, decisive T's. It is not random at all, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Go ahead and read it. Sophie's eyes quickly scanned the text. The moonlight shines on the forgotten vineyard where the fox sleeps under the 9th stone, she translated aloud. We already know what it says in English, Alessandro said, his impatience obvious. The problem is that it means absolutely nothing. There is no vineyard, and there is no fox. It is a book code, Sophie explained, her mind racing, connecting memories from long ago. My father, he used to read me very specific stories when I was a child. He loved The Little Prince and Les Miserables. But this particular line, she tapped the fragile paper. The fox is a reference to Aesop's fables, specifically the 1890 edition. He owned a first edition that he kept in his library. Alessandro slowly rose from his chair. And the 9th stone refers to page 9, or perhaps the 9th fable, which is the fox and the grapes. Sophie lifted her gaze to meet Alessandro's. He was not trying to tell you where the money was hidden, he was telling you where to find the key. Where is it? Alessandro demanded, leaning his weight over the desk toward her. The forgotten vineyard, Sophie murmured, thinking aloud. She closed her eyes, trying to summon a distant memory. When I was just 10 years old, we buried a time capsule together in the old vineyard back in Provence. This was just before we lost the entire estate. We buried it directly under the 9th stone of the garden wall. A look of sudden understanding dawned in Alessandro's eyes. Provence, he said. The drive is located in France. If he has not moved it since then, Sophie confirmed. We have to leave now, Alessandro said without a moment's hesitation. He jabbed a button on his desk phone. Dante, prepare the jet immediately. We are departing for Marseille in 1 hour. Wait a minute, Sophie cried out. I cannot possibly go to France with you. I am currently wanted by the French authorities because of my father's outstanding debts. Alessandro moved from behind the desk. He came to a stop just inches away from her. The very air between them seemed to crackle with an unspoken energy. I essentially own the French customs agents at the Marseille airport, he told her, his voice low and confident. You will not be arrested, but you are the only person who can locate that specific stone. You are the only one who truly knows the layout of that estate. He reached out and gently tucked a damp strand of her hair behind her ear. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the evening. Help me find this drive, Sophie. Help me to finally destroy Greco, and I will give you your entire life back. I will have all your debts cleared. I will even buy you l'Étoile Noire if that is what you want. I do not want the restaurant, Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. I want my father. A dark shadow passed over Alessandro's face. He looked away for a fraction of a second, but it was a hesitation that Sophie immediately noticed. What is it? She demanded sharply. What are you hiding from me? Sophie, is he dead? Her voice cracked on the last word. You have to tell me. Alessandro put his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm. He is not dead. But he is not just missing, Sophie. He did not run away from his problems. Then where is he? Alessandro took a long, deep breath. He is currently being held in the dungeon of Stefano Greco's private villa in Tuscany. He has been imprisoned there for the last 3 years. The letter was not sent right before he vanished. It was smuggled out of the villa just last week. Sophie's entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He is alive. All this time, and you knew. I had my suspicions. This letter finally confirmed them. We have to go get him, Sophie shouted, pulling herself away from his grasp. Forget about the drive. We have to save him right now. We cannot save him without that drive, Alessandro roared back at her, his voice echoing in the large room. Greco is holding him as leverage specifically to get those codes. If we try to storm the villa now, he will kill your father without a second thought. Arthur, giving him that drive is a death sentence for your father. There is no other option, absolutely none, except to get our hands on it first. Alessandro's plan was simple and brutal. We will decode the accounts and completely freeze every asset Greco possesses. When we make him a poor man, his hired army will abandon him. That is when we will make our move. Sophie could only stare at him, the air trapped in her lungs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The danger had just escalated beyond anything she could have imagined. This was no longer a simple matter of money. This was about saving her father's life. She examined the figure before her, this powerful Mafia leader, this creature of the night. In a terrible twist of fate, he was the only person who could help her. Her voice was a quiet, steady thing when she spoke. We are going to France. Alessandro gave a single, sharp nod. Find your coat. But as Sophie moved to obey, her eyes caught on a manila file resting on the edge of his immense desk. The folder was slightly ajar. Clipped to the inside cover was a photograph, a picture of her. It had been taken from a distance, capturing her as she worked outside l'Étoile Noire just 2 weeks prior. The blood in her veins turned to ice. A choked whisper escaped her lips. You already knew. She spun around to face him again, the sharp sting of betrayal flooding her eyes. You were never at the restaurant for a meal. You were there for me. Alessandro made no move to deny the accusation. He remained standing, a powerful silhouette against the glittering darkness of the city skyline. His voice was calm, devoid of any emotion. I was there to determine if Arthur Dubois' daughter would be worth all this trouble. And? Sophie challenged, her voice trembling as hot tears threatened to spill. Tell me, am I? Alessandro closed the distance between them, his deliberate steps silent on the rug. He did not halt his advance until his chest was a mere breath from hers. He gazed down at her, his dark eyes ignited with a fierce possessiveness, and something else, a feeling that felt terrifyingly close to genuine affection. His voice was a low whisper, echoing the first words he ever spoke to her that night. "Read the menu, Sophie." He paused, his voice turning rough and raw with intensity. "You are worth setting the entire world on fire for." The sleek private jet landed smoothly on a secluded airstrip somewhere outside Marseille. The sun was just beginning to spill its colors across the horizon, painting the French landscape in shades of deep violet and molten gold. The journey had been silent, thick with unspoken thoughts. For most of the flight, Alessandro was occupied with his encrypted satellite phone, issuing sharp orders in Italian to his crews in both New York and a specialized strike team assembling in Tuscany. Sophie, meanwhile, could only stare out the small window, her fingers restlessly twisting the hem of the leggings she had been given. Her mind felt like a battlefield, littered with fragmented memories and rising fear. A plain, forgettable rental car, a Peugeot covered in a fine layer of dust, was parked and waiting. Alessandro took the wheel. He drove with the same focused precision and aggressive self-assurance that defined his every action. After nearly an hour of navigating winding roads flanked by tall, solemn cypress trees, Sophie finally spoke. "We are getting very close. You need to turn left at the next intersection. The paved road disappears from there." He followed her direction, turning the car onto a rough gravel path. A weathered sign, almost completely consumed by thick ivy, faintly read, "Château du Bois." What remained of the estate was just a skeleton, a ghost of what it once was. The main house, which she remembered as a grand manor built from warm, sun-yellow stone, was now shuttered with crude boards, its roof caving in. But it was the vineyard that truly broke her heart. It was a chaotic wilderness. The vines that had once yielded grapes for an award-winning Syrah were now a hopeless, tangled mass, a thicket of thorns that was actively strangling the very soil that gave it life. "Stop the car here," Sophie whispered, her voice tight. "We have to continue on foot. The sound of the engine will travel too far." Alessandro immediately cut the power. He reached into the back and retrieved a heavy duffel bag. From it, he produced a flashlight which he passed to Sophie, but his own hand remained firmly resting on the pistol holstered at his side. "You will walk directly behind me. The moment you spot anyone, you get down on the ground instantly. Do not make a sound. Do not even think about running. Do you understand me?" A sad smile touched her lips as she stepped out of the car and into the crisp morning air. "I spent my entire childhood playing hide-and-seek among these vines, Alessandro." The familiar scent of wild thyme and rich, damp earth filled her lungs, causing a sharp ache in her chest. "This place is a part of me. I know every secret way to vanish here." They advanced cautiously through the overgrown rows of grapes. The silence was profound, a heavy blanket broken only by the rhythmic crunch of dried leaves and twigs beneath their heavy boots. "The old garden wall is on the northern edge of the property," Sophie quietly instructed. They soon arrived at the ancient stone barrier that marked the estate's boundary. It was old, weathered, and shrouded in green moss. Sophie's breath hitched as she began to count the foundation stones aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "1, 2, 3. It's this one, right here." She indicated a large, smooth river stone set near the bottom, precisely the ninth stone in the row. Alessandro immediately dropped to a knee. He produced a wickedly sharp knife from his boot and carefully worked the blade into the seam beneath the stone. With a low grunt of pure physical effort, he pried it upwards. Tucked into the cool, dark earth beneath was a weathered, rusted tin box, the kind that once held biscuits. Sophie collapsed to her knees and snatched it from the ground. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could not manage to work the lid free. Alessandro's large, steady hands gently covered her own. "Allow me." With a simple movement, he popped the lid open. A faint, musty smell of old paper and memories drifted out. Inside lay a collection of childhood treasures: a perfectly dried flower, a small plastic toy soldier, and a crayon drawing of a horse. taped securely to the very bottom of the tin, was a small, silver USB drive. My father did it, Sophie breathed, hot tears of relief finally overflowing and streaming down her face. He actually managed to hide it here all this time. Take it and secure it, Alessandro ordered, his gaze never ceasing its vigilant scan of the surrounding trees. We have finally found what we came for. We are leaving. Click. The sound was sharp, metallic, and absolutely unmistakable. It was the sound of a gun's hammer being pulled back. Do not even twitch. The voice was a low sneer that slithered out from the dark maze of vines. And drop your weapon, Moretti. That is, unless you want to see this girl's brains used as fertilizer for these pathetic grapes. Alessandro's entire body went rigid. With deliberate, slow movements, he raised his empty hands into the air. From the deep shadows, 3 figures emerged. Their leader was a brute, a mountain of a man, distinguished by a jagged scar that cut clean through his left eyebrow. He was aiming a suppressed MP5 submachine gun, its barrel pointed directly at the center of Sophie's chest. Alessandro's greeting was shockingly calm, almost bored. Luca, I see that Stefano Greco finally decided to let you off your leash. Luca's smile was a cruel slash across his face. He knew you would eventually come sniffing around for the girl's inheritance. Now, hand over the drive. And if I do not, Alessandro countered, then I will put a bullet in her, take the drive from your corpse, and leave your bodies here for the crows to feast on. For a fraction of a second, Alessandro's eyes locked with Sophie's. In that silent gaze, he conveyed a single powerful message. Trust me. Very well, Alessandro said, his voice conceding defeat. He reached into the open tin, his fingers closing around the small drive, and held it up for them to see. The silver casing of the drive caught the early morning light, glinting brightly. You want this? Then you had better be quick. With a flick of his wrist, Alessandro launched the small object high into the air, sending it sailing toward a dense, thorny thicket to his right. Luca's gaze, and that of his men, instinctively shot upward to follow the glittering arc of the silver device. That momentary distraction, that single split second of inattention, was precisely the opening Alessandro needed. He ignored his own weapon. Instead, he lunged directly at Sophie, driving her down into the dirt behind the solid stone wall, just as Luca opened fire. A stream of bullets slammed into the ancient stone, sending chips flying just inches over their heads. "Stay down!" Alessandro roared, the command ripping from his throat. He twisted onto his back, drawing his pistol in a single, impossibly fluid motion, and began firing blindly over the top of the wall. A choked scream tore through the morning air. One of the henchmen crumpled to the ground. "Get into the vines, now!" Alessandro commanded. He grabbed the collar of Sophie's shirt and physically hauled her into the deep, protective cover of the untamed vineyard. They scrambled desperately on their hands and knees, moving through the cold dirt as sharp thorns clawed at their clothes and tore at their skin. Behind them, they could hear the heavy crunch of footsteps drawing closer. "Spread out and find them!" Luca bellowed in rage. "The drive!" Sophie hissed, her words laced with rising panic. "You just threw it away. It was the toy soldier." Alessandro gritted out between breaths, skillfully reloading his weapon as they took cover behind the thick, gnarled trunk of an ancient vine. He quickly tapped his breast pocket. "The real drive is right here with me." Sophie could only stare at him in disbelief. "You are completely insane." He offered a grim smile. "I am relentlessly practical. Now you need to listen to me very carefully. I am going to create a diversion and draw their fire. When I do, you run straight for the car. Do not stop and do not look back. Absolutely not." Sophie seized his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "I am not leaving you here to die." Alessandro's gaze softened. For just a heartbeat, the carefully constructed mask of the unfeeling mob boss slipped away, revealing a man who was utterly terrified of losing the one precious thing he had only just discovered. "Sophie, I am begging you. They are flanking to our left, Sophie whispered urgently, her ears perfectly tuned to the subtle sounds of a place she knew better than anyone. She pointed through the leaves. There is an old, dry irrigation ditch about 10 yards in that direction. It runs all the way back to the road. If we are fast, we can both get out of here. Alessandro followed her gesture, his eyes assessing the path she indicated. He then turned his gaze back to her, and a fierce, predatory grin spread across his face. Then by all means, lead the way, mademoiselle. In that moment they became a single synchronized unit, moving with shared purpose. They dove headfirst into the dusty, dry ditch just as a hail of bullets ripped through the very spot where they had been hiding. They ran hunched low to the ground, their lungs screaming for air, until the shape of the rental car materialized through the vines ahead. Alessandro vaulted over the driver's side door as Sophie scrambled into the passenger seat. He roared the engine to life, spinning the car in a violent circle that threw a massive cloud of gravel and dust, just as Luca and his remaining man burst from the edge of the woods, firing their weapons wildly. The rear windshield exploded into a spiderweb of cracks. Sophie screamed and threw herself down. With a curse, Alessandro slammed the Peugeot into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The small car shot down the dirt track like a rocket, leaving the furious gunman choking in a thick cloud of dust. "Are you hit?" Alessandro yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine and the wind whipping through the shattered back window. "No!" Sophie quickly checked herself over. She was covered in dirt and bleeding from a dozen angry scratches from the thorns, but there were no bullet wounds. She looked over at Alessandro. He was grinning from ear to ear, a wild, triumphant expression fueled by pure adrenaline. "You did well back there, Sophie." He let out a short, sharp laugh. "You did exceptionally well." Sophie stared at the man beside her. He was dangerous. He was lethal. And in that moment, he was the most exhilarating thing she had ever experienced in her life. Her own voice was remarkably steady when she spoke. "So, we are going to Tuscany now?" The adrenaline-fueled grin vanished from Alessandro's face, instantly replaced by a look of cold, hard determination. "To Tuscany," he confirmed, his voice low and dangerous. "We are going to kill a monster." Stefano Greco's Tuscan villa was less a home and more a fortress, one constructed with blood money and human suffering. It sat nestled in the idyllic rolling hills, a place of breathtaking ancient beauty that was fundamentally rotten from its core. Night had completely fallen by the time Alessandro and Sophie finally arrived. There was no sneaking around this time, no covert entry. They drove a sleek black Mercedes, provided by Alessandro's local contacts, directly up to the massive front gate. Alessandro had changed into a fresh, impeccably tailored suit, black on black. Sophie was now wearing a stunning red dress, not the worn, cheap uniform from her job at Lido Noir, but an elegant silk gown that Alessandro had somehow acquired for her during a brief stop in Florence. She looked like a queen about to ascend her throne. She felt like a lamb being led to the slaughter. "Remember our plan," Alessandro said quietly, as the heavy iron gates groaned open to admit them. "You are my leverage. I am here as a potential buyer. Under no circumstances do we show any fear." "I am not afraid," Sophie lied through her teeth. "Good," he replied, "because a man like Greco can smell fear, and he feeds on it." They were led by heavily armed guards through the front doors and into a vast main hall. It was a cavernous space, adorned with priceless Renaissance masterpieces and filled with the faint, unsettling smell of sulfur. Stefano Greco was seated alone at the head of a ridiculously long banquet table. He was a short, fleshy man with vacant, dead eyes and a wet smile that revealed far too much of his gums. "Alessandro!" Greco called out, spreading his arms in a gesture of false welcome. "And look, the little waitress from New York. Welcome to my home. I do hope your journey was a pleasant one." "Let's cut the meaningless pleasantries, Stefano." Alessandro's voice was like ice, echoing off the cold stone walls. He refused the offer to sit. Instead, he positioned himself directly behind Sophie's chair, placing a firm, protective hand on her shoulder. "We have retrieved the drive." "Is that so?" Greco said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his red wine. "Then by all means, show me." Alessandro reached into his coat, produced the small silver USB, and placed it firmly in the center of the polished table. "Arthur Dubois," he stated. Greco's ugly smile widened. He snapped his fingers sharply. A side door creaked open, and two of his guards entered, dragging a battered and bruised man between them. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. It was a horrified gasp. "Papa." Arthur Dubois was no longer a man. He was a ruin. His body was gaunt and covered in dark bruises, with one eye swollen completely shut against the world. He took a staggering step forward, a puppet with its strings cut, barely managing to stay on his feet. "Sophie!" Arthur's voice was a dry, rasping sound as he forced his head up. His one good eye pleaded with her. "No, my Sophie, you have to run. Get out of here." "Let him go," Sophie commanded, her voice trembling but firm as she began to stand. Alessandro's hand clamped down on her shoulder, a heavy weight holding her in place. "The drive comes first," Greco said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He gracefully picked up the small USB stick from the table. He slid it into a laptop that was already waiting, its screen casting a cold blue light on his face. He typed a few keys, his confidence absolute, before his expression soured into a frustrated frown. "It is encrypted," Greco spat, the words dripping with venom. "It has a biometric lock. Voice recognition." His cold eyes landed on Sophie. "Your father is a clever man." Greco sneered, his voice a low hiss. "He made his own daughter the password." Alessandro's grip on Sophie's shoulder tightened, a silent warning. "She will unlock it," he stated, "but only after Arthur is safely in the car and on his way to the airport." Greco let out a laugh. It was not a sound of humor, but a dry, hacking noise like stones grinding together. "You are in no position to make bargains, boy. I have 50 of my people on these grounds." "You," he gestured dismissively, "have a waitress." As if to prove his point, Greco produced a heavy pistol from beneath the table, aiming it directly at Arthur's head. The metal gleamed menacingly in the dim light. "Unlock the drive now, Sophie, or your father is going to paint the wall." "No!" Sophie screamed, her heart seizing in her chest. "Do it!" Greco ordered, and the click of the hammer being cocked echoed through the silent room. Sophie's terrified eyes shot to Alessandro. His face was an unreadable mask of stone, completely devoid of emotion, but the hand on her shoulder squeezed twice, a brief, firm pressure. It was a signal, a hidden promise in the midst of terror. Sophie took a deep breath and rose to her feet. With measured steps, she walked toward the laptop at the far end of the long, polished table. She could feel the predatory gaze of every single guard following her every move, their eyes like physical weights on her back. She leaned over the computer, its cold metal pressing against her hands. A prompt on the screen glowed, asking for a voice phrase to be spoken. She lifted her head and looked Greco directly in the eye, a spark of defiance igniting within her. "You want the code?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. "I want the world, my dear," Greco replied, his greed naked and raw. "Now give it to me." Sophie leaned close to the microphone. "The fox knows many tricks." She spoke clearly in perfect French, her tone even and controlled, but the hedgehog knows one big one. The computer screen flashed a brilliant green. Access granted. Lines of data began to scroll. A river of information, bank accounts, secret routing numbers, the entire architectural blueprint of Greco's criminal syndicate. Greco's eyes widened, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. "Yes. Yes. It is all here. Every last file," Greco whispered in triumph. He finally tore his eyes from the screen to look at his guards. "Kill them," he commanded, his voice casual, as if ordering a meal. "All of them." Sophie froze, the blood turning to ice in her veins. "A deal is a deal, Stefano," Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a terrifying growl that rumbled through the room. Greco laughed again, already lost in the columns of numbers on the screen. "I am a criminal, Alessandro, not a gentleman. I do not make deals, I make corpses." "So do I," Alessandro replied, and in that instant, the lights went out. The world plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. Then, chaos erupted. Alessandro had moved before the lights even fully died. He had activated a remote trigger in his pocket, a timer he had set the very moment Sophie spoke the code, cutting the main power line to the entire villa. In the pitch-black void, the night exploded with the sound of gunfire. Alessandro tackled Sophie, pulling her to the ground and shielding her body with his own, as he fired 3 precise shots toward the last known position of Greco's guards. He was wearing advanced night vision contacts, a secret advantage. They were blind. "Get to Arthur!" Alessandro roared in her ear, his voice a commanding presence in the mayhem. Sophie scrambled across the cold, hard floor, crawling desperately toward the spot where she had last seen her father fall. "Papa, Papa," she whispered into the darkness. Her searching hands found his, frail and trembling. "I have got you, Sophie," Arthur wheezed, his voice weak but present. "You need to go." She shook her head fiercely. "Not without you." Suddenly, the emergency lights flickered on, casting the room in a dim, hellish red, bathing everything in the color of blood. In the crimson twilight, Alessandro was a blur of lethal motion. His movements were terrifyingly efficient, brutally precise, a dance of death. He disarmed one guard, using the man's body as a human shield against another, and systematically cleared a path to the door. But Greco was gone, and the laptop was gone with him. "He ran!" Alessandro shouted over the noise. "Take your father to the car. Dante is waiting for you at the back gate. Now go!" "Where are you going?" Sophie screamed, her voice raw with panic, as she hauled her father to his feet, his weight a heavy burden. "To finish it," Alessandro said, his face set like granite. He turned and sprinted toward a side door, disappearing into the shadows. Sophie dragged her father through the chaotic scene, dodging overturned tables and broken glass. They burst out into the cool night air of the courtyard where a black Mercedes was waiting, its engine humming. Dante, Alessandro's loyal bodyguard, was there, laying down cover fire. "Get in now!" Dante yelled. Sophie managed to shove her weakened father into the safety of the back seat, but she did not get in herself. She hesitated, looking back at the sprawling villa, as the sound of more gunshots echoed from within. "Go!" Sophie yelled, slamming the heavy car door shut. "Get him to safety! Sophie, no!" Arthur screamed from inside the car, his face a mask of terror behind the glass. "Drive, Dante!" Sophie commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. The car's tires screeched as it sped away into the night. Sophie turned and ran back into the heart of the villa. She was no longer just a waitress. She was not a victim to be rescued. She was a woman in love with a dangerous king, and she would not let him die alone. She found them in the library, a vast room lined with ancient books. Greco was pinned down behind a massive oak desk, clutching the precious laptop. Alessandro was taking cover behind a marble pillar, his ammunition clearly running low. "It is over, Alessandro," Greco shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "I have all the accounts. I am transferring the funds right this second." "You have nothing!" Alessandro yelled back, his voice tight with frustration. Sophie saw Greco's finger hovering over the enter key on the laptop, a single press away from victory. Her eyes darted around the room, frantically searching for anything she could use as a weapon. She saw it then. A heavy bronze bust of Julius Caesar perched on a high shelf directly above Greco's head. The shelf itself was supported by a single ornate wooden bracket. Sophie did not have a gun, but she had grabbed a heavy Magnum bottle of wine from a banquet table on her way in. She did not stop to think. She simply acted. With all the strength she could muster, she threw the bottle. It was not aimed at Greco. Her target was the wooden bracket. The bottle soared through the air and smashed into the wood with a deafening crack. The bracket snapped instantly. The heavy bronze bust of the Roman emperor plummeted downwards. It crashed onto Greco's arm with a sickening, wet crunch of breaking bone. Greco let out an agonized scream, the laptop tumbling from his shattered hand. The gun he was holding skittered across the polished floor. Alessandro stepped out from behind the pillar. He did not hesitate for even a second. He raised his pistol and fired a single, definitive shot. Stefano Greco slumped forward over the desk, and profound silence reclaimed the room, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Alessandro stood there, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked at the dead man, then at the fallen laptop, and finally at Sophie, who was standing in the doorway, panting for breath, her red dress torn, her hands empty but steady. He walked over to her, his steps deliberate. He did not say a single word. He simply grabbed her face between his large hands and kissed her. It was a kiss born of survival, fueled by adrenaline, and sealed with absolute possession. It tasted of gunpowder, blood, and the sweet relief of victory. He finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet air. "I told you to get in the car," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I do not take orders well," Sophie whispered back, a faint smile touching her lips. "I am French." Alessandro let out a short, breathy laugh, a sound of pure relief. He glanced over at the laptop lying on the floor. "He did not transfer the money, did he?" Sophie asked, her voice barely audible. "No," Alessandro said, his eyes finding hers again. "Because the code you gave him did not unlock the funds. It uploaded a self-executing virus that just wiped every single server he owns. He died broke, with absolutely nothing." Sophie smiled, a genuine, brilliant smile. "The hedgehog," she murmured, "knows one big trick." Alessandro scooped her up into his arms, easily lifting her off the ground and ignoring her soft protests. "Let us go home, Sophie. I am starving." 6 months later, the rain falling on the streets of Manhattan was a soft, cleansing mist this time. Inside Le Cygne Noir, the atmosphere was buzzing with warm conversation and the clinking of glasses. The restaurant was now under new management. Sophie moved with grace and confidence through the tables, not as a servant taking orders, but as the owner in complete command. She wore a perfectly tailored suit, her posture radiating an authority she had always possessed but never shown. She stopped at table number 4. Arthur Dubois sat there, looking healthy and relaxed, sipping a cup of tea while reading a newspaper. He looked up and smiled at his daughter. "The inventory is all done, Papa," Sophie said, leaning down to kiss his cheek. "Good," he replied, his eyes full of pride. "Now go. He is waiting for you." Sophie walked toward the back, to the most private booth in the restaurant. Alessandro Moretti sat there waiting. He was not wearing one of his usual dark suits. Instead, he wore a casual cashmere sweater that made him look younger, softer, and lighter. The dangerous darkness that once haunted his eyes had been replaced by a steady, unwavering warmth that was reserved only for her. On the table between them sat a single bottle of wine. Chateau Mouton Rothschild, 1982, Sophie noted as she sat down opposite him. A bold choice for a Tuesday. "I am celebrating," Alessandro said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "And what exactly are we celebrating?" Sophie asked, intrigued. Alessandro reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a gun. He did not pull out a flash drive. He placed a small, black velvet box on the polished table between them. "I finally found someone who can read the entire menu without my help," he said, a playful smirk dancing on his lips. "And I do not intend to ever let her dine alone again." Sophie looked from the small box to his earnest face. "Is that a command, Mr. Moretti?" "It is a proposal, Sophie," he said, his voice serious now. Sophie smiled. the very same devastating smile that had brought a criminal empire to its knees. She reached for her wineglass, her movements deliberate and elegant. Then you should pour the wine, Alessandro. It seems we have a lot to discuss. And that is the story of how Sophie Dubois went from being the invisible girl at table number 4 to the undisputed queen of the New York underworld. She proved to everyone that real power is not about muscles or guns or intimidation. It is about intelligence, unwavering courage, and knowing exactly which wine to pair with perfectly executed revenge. Alessandro Moretti was a king who thought he was saving a pawn, but in the end, she was the queen who saved him. If you loved this story of danger, romance, and incredibly sweet justice, please do us a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure you subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss another story. And please tell me in the comments, if you were in Sophie's shoes, would you have gone back into that villa? I cannot wait to read your answers. I will see you all in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and heartfelt inspiration. Thank you for watching.